There are debts that cannot be measured in dollars. Debts that live in the stitches of a suit, in the fabric of a dress, in the calluses on a seamstress's hands. This is the story of a mother who sewed kings, and the daughter who wore her courage to the one place on earth that could save them both. The digital clock beside the hospital bed glowed an unrelenting neon green in the dimly lit apartment. 9:30 p.m. The numbers felt less like a measurement of time and more like a countdown to absolute ruin. In exactly 2.5 hours, the heavy wooden door of the Bronx apartment would be violently hammered open by Victor Sloan. It wasn't a possibility. It wasn't a threat. It was an inevitable, suffocating certainty, like the tightening of a noose. Sloan wasn't a man who made idle threats. He was a predator who fed on the desperate, operating in the bleeding margins between hospital billing departments and human tragedy. Gianna Marchetti stood before the cracked, full-length mirror in the corner of her mother's cramped bedroom. She was 24 years old, though the weight of the last 3 years had aged her spirit a decade. But looking in the mirror, despite the exhaustion, despite the permanent violet shadows under her deep brown eyes, her beauty was undeniable. She possessed a radiant face, framed by thick, dark chestnut wavy hair that she had left loose tonight, cascading past her broad shoulders in heavy, rich waves. Her skin was a marvel, fair, white, glowing, clean, attractive skin that seemed to catch and hold the meager light of the room. She was a plus-size woman, a proud size 18, with a full round face, high cheekbones, full natural lips, and a small, delicate beauty mark resting gently below her left eye. It was the exact same beauty mark her mother had. Tonight, she was not wearing her usual flour-dusted bakery uniform. Tonight, her generously curved body, the wide hips, the soft waist, the full bust, was encased in the only fine thing her family owned, the crimson-red dress. It was a masterpiece of tailoring. Structured bodice, fitted waist, flowing skirt that ended precisely at the knee. It didn't just fit her, it commanded her to stand taller. It had been made with exquisite, painstaking care by her mother's own hands, meant for a Moreno family gala 20 years ago that Lucia was never invited to attend. Lucia had always sewed it to fit the daughter she hoped would wear it someday. It was an armor of silk and thread. Behind her, the rhythmic, labored breathing of her mother, Lucia, filled the quiet room. Lucia was 52, but stage 3 breast cancer and the brutal, chemical onslaught of chemotherapy had hollowed her out, leaving her fragile, thin, and bedridden. The once strong hands that could cut fabric by feel, that could sew invisible hems, that had clothed the most powerful Mafia don on the eastern seaboard for 18 years, now lay trembling on the thin cotton blanket. They owed Victor Sloan $47,000. It was the cost of keeping Lucia alive after Marco Marchetti had died of a sudden heart attack, leaving them drowning in medical debt. Sloan, a polished, slimy man who drove a leased BMW and smelled of cheap cologne and predatory intent, had ballooned the debt to $72,000 with a 40% interest rate. Tonight, at midnight, he was coming for the apartment. He was coming to take the very roof over their heads, the sewing room that held Lucia's life's work, the only sanctuary they had left. Lucia was supposed to go to the Moreno estate tonight. She had a standing invitation from old Salvatore Moreno himself, given decades ago. Come to the house whenever you need anything. But earlier this evening, Lucia had collapsed trying to stand, her body finally surrendering to the ravages of the illness. So Gianna was going instead. She wasn't brave. She wasn't fearless. It wasn't an absence of terror that drove her, it was a sheer, terrifying necessity. She picked up her mother's leather portfolio from the dresser. It was worn, cracked along the spine, and surprisingly heavy. Inside were letters from Salvatore Moreno, on thick cream paper, black and white photographs of impeccably tailored suits on mannequins, fabric swatches pinned to cards, and one item Gianna didn't know about, a photograph hidden deep in the inner pocket. Gianna. Lucia's voice was a fragile whisper, a sound like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Gianna turned, moving to the bedside, dropping to her knees so her face was level with her mother's.
I'm here, Mama.
Lucia reached out, her trembling fingers brushing a stray wave of dark chestnut hair from Gianna's glowing cheek.
You look like your father, so beautiful, so strong.
Lucia's eyes, the same deep brown with gold flecks as Gianna's, burned with a fierce, fading pride. Tell them Lucia sends her daughter. Tell them she sewed every suit the old Don wore. They'll remember. I will tell them, Mama. I promise. Gianna kissed her mother's frail hand, the skin paper-thin and translucent. She stood up, the crimson dress flowing around her strong, thick legs. She slipped on her simple black flats. She didn't own heels. She didn't need them. The dress, the portfolio, and her mother's legacy were her elevation. At 10 o'clock, Gianna walked out to the street. The night air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of asphalt and distant rain. Her battered Honda Civic sat under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp. She climbed into the driver's seat, the worn fabric scratching against her bare legs. The car smelled faintly of stale coffee and fear. She turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, a pathetic sound in the quiet street. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She glanced at the passenger seat, where the heavy leather portfolio rested like a silent passenger. In the cracked rearview mirror, her own deep brown eyes stared back at her, wide and terrified, but underscored by a grim, unbreakable resolve. Environmental storytelling surrounded her, the cracked mirror reflecting her fragmented world, a faded hospital parking pass resting on the dashboard, empty orange prescription bottles rattling in the cup holder. But against all this decay, the crimson dress glowed with a defiant, vibrant life. The drive across the city was a blur of neon lights and shadow. She was leaving the Bronx, leaving the world of survival, and entering a realm of unimaginable power and wealth. She was driving to the Moreno estate, a fortress of black iron gates, armed guards, and absolute authority. She had never been there. She had never met a Moreno. She was a plus-size woman in a handmade dress and borrowed courage, driving a dying car into the lion's den to beg for her mother's life. She didn't know that behind those gates, Dominic Moreno, the 32-year-old Don of the family, had been searching for her mother for 3 years. She didn't know that his grandfather's dying words were a command to find the very woman who had sewn the dress she was wearing. She only knew that she had less than 2 hours to save her home. The estate appeared like a dark monolith against the night sky. Massive black iron gates, easily 20 feet high, barred the entrance. Security lights blazed with blinding intensity, cutting through the darkness. Beyond the gates, manicured grounds stretched toward a sprawling, lit mansion that looked more like a castle than a home. Gianna pulled the Honda Civic to a stop before the intercom panel. The car idled rough, a metallic rattling sound that felt embarrassingly loud in the pristine silence of the estate. She took a deep breath, the crimson silk of her bodice tightening across her full chest. She grabbed the leather portfolio, clutching it against her generous hip like a shield, and stepped out of the car. The night wind whipped her dark chestnut hair around her face. She walked to the intercom, her fair, white, glowing skin illuminated by the harsh security lights. Her hand trembled as she reached out and pressed the metal button. A sharp, static hum, followed by a woman's crisp, elegant voice. "State your business." It was Elena Corsetti, Dominic's consigliere and head of household security. A woman who was the first line of defense, who decided who lived, who died, and who got to walk through those gates. My name is Gianna Marchetti," Gianna said, her voice shaking. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into her words. "My mother is sick. She used to sew for Salvatore Moreno. Please, I need to speak to someone." There was a long, terrible pause. Gianna could feel the invisible stare of the security cameras tracing the curves of her body, the bold red of her dress, the desperation in her posture. "The Don doesn't take unannounced visitors." Elena's voice came back, cold, professional, dismissing. "Leave the premises immediately." It wasn't a request. It was an order from a world that didn't tolerate disobedience. Gianna's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run. She wanted to get back in her car and hide. But the image of her mother's frail form on that bed, the thought of Victor Sloane's slimy smile as he tore up their lease, anchored her to the pavement. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She leaned closer to the intercom, her deep brown eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate fire. "My mother made suits for Salvatore Moreno for 18 years, Gianna stated, her voice dropping an octave, losing its tremble and gaining a fierce, clinical precision. "She has cancer. A loan shark is taking our home at midnight. She was supposed to come herself, but she collapsed. I came instead." She gripped the portfolio tighter. "I am not here for charity. I am here because my mother earned the right to ask." Silence stretched over the intercom. It was a thick, heavy silence. Elena Corsetti, sitting in the security room, staring at the monitors, saw the beautiful, curvy woman in the crimson dress. She heard the raw, undeniable truth in her voice. It was a voice that didn't belong to a beggar. It belonged to a daughter fighting a war. A loud, metallic clack echoed through the night. The massive black iron gates began to swing slowly open, the sound of heavy gears grinding against the silence. "Drive up to the main entrance." "Leave the car. Security will escort you." Elena's voice was different now, not warm, but not dismissing. Gianna let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She climbed back into the dying Honda Civic and drove through the gates of an empire. "Before we go further, are you Team Gianna or Team Lucia? Drop it in the comments and tell us where you're watching from tonight." The main foyer of the Moreno mansion was vast, echoing, and terrifying. The floor was a seamless expanse of black marble that reflected the light of a massive crystal chandelier hanging from a vaulted ceiling. Dark mahogany paneled the walls, exuding an aura of old money and deep, unquestionable power. Gianna walked through the double doors, clutching the leather portfolio to her chest. Armed men in dark, perfectly tailored suits stood at strategic points around the room. As she entered, they stepped aside, their eyes tracking her. She felt impossibly small in this vast space, a solitary figure in a crimson dress surrounded by wolves. Yet, her chin was up. Her fair, white, glowing, clean, attractive skin seemed to radiate a nervous energy. She was a lamb walking into the lion's den, except this lamb had teeth, and she was carrying the weight of a dying mother's legacy. Elena Corsetti met her at the base of the grand, sweeping staircase. Elena was sharp, elegant, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a tailored black pantsuit that commanded immediate respect. She looked Gianna up and down, her gaze lingering on the crimson dress and the worn leather portfolio. "Follow me," Elena said simply, turning on her heel. Gianna followed, her black flats making soft sounds on the marble. They walked down a long, quiet hallway lined with original oil paintings and closed doors. The air here was heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and something faintly metallic. Power. Elena stopped before a set of massive, intricately carved oak doors. She knocked once, a sharp rap, and pushed them open. "Miss Marchetti," Elena announced, stepping aside to let Gianna enter. The private study was a cavernous room, wrapped in dark leather, towering bookshelves, and the smell of expensive cigars and old paper. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. At the far end, behind a massive, imposing oak desk, sat the man who held her mother's life in his hands, Dominic Moreno. He was 32, but he possessed the gravity of a man twice his age. He was terrifyingly large, 6'5", with a bodybuilder physique that stretched the seams of his custom-tailored charcoal three-piece suit. He had extremely broad, powerful, wide shoulders, a massive chest, and a V-tapered build that spoke of brutal, raw strength. His dark black hair was cropped short on the sides, longer on top, framing a sharp, angular face with a strong Roman nose and heavy stubble. A thin, jagged scar cut through his right eyebrow, a remnant of childhood, not violence. On his right hand, resting on the desk, gleamed a heavy gold signet ring, his grandfather's ring, the only jewelry he wore. He was reviewing a stack of documents when she entered. He slowly looked up, his dark eyes, so intense they felt like a physical weight pressing against her, locked onto her. He saw the crimson dress. He saw the fair, glowing skin, the rich chestnut hair, the full, generous curves. His face showed absolutely nothing. It was a mask carved from stone, but his eyes missed nothing. "Sit," he commanded, his voice deep, measured, a low rumble that resonated in her chest. Gianna walked to the heavy leather chair across from his desk and sat down. She didn't sink into the cushions. She sat on the very edge, her back straight, the portfolio resting on her lap. She was looking him dead in the eye, refusing to look away, refusing to let him see the terror vibrating in her veins. Dominic leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the desk. "You told my security your mother sewed for Salvatore Moreno." It wasn't a question. It was a demand for proof. Gianna unclasped the worn leather portfolio. The sound of the metal snap was loud in the quiet room. She opened it, laying it flat on her lap. "She was his private seamstress for 18 years, Gianna said, her voice steady. "From 1988 to 2006, she made every suit he wore." She reached into the portfolio and pulled out the first layer of evidence. Black and white photographs of impeccably tailored suits on wooden mannequins. She laid them on the desk, sliding them across the polished oak toward him. Dominic looked down. His eyes narrowed slightly. These were his grandfather's suits, the charcoal pinstripe Salvatore had worn to Dominic's first communion, the navy double-breasted suit he had worn when he took Dominic to the opera in Rome, the grey flannel he wore to sit in this very chair. He remembered the smell of the fabric, the precise, flawless cut that made his grandfather look invincible. He hadn't seen these suits since his grandfather died. Nobody had kept them. They were lost to time. "She made these?" he asked, his voice quieter now, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of his demeanor. "Every stitch," Gianna answered. She cut the fabric by feel. She sewed invisible hems. My mother, Lucia, is a master tailor. She pulled out the next layer. Thick cream paper, letters of recommendation, handwritten in elegant, sprawling script. Salvatore's handwriting. Dominic recognized the ink. He recognized the heavy, deliberate strokes of the pen. He picked up one of the letters, his large, calloused thumb brushing over his grandfather's signature. To whom it may concern, Lucia is the only woman who ever made me look like a king. Her hands are blessed. Where is she? Dominic asked, his gaze snapping back to Gianna. She is in a bed in a Bronx apartment, dying of stage 3 breast cancer, Gianna stated. The words were clinical, precise, devastating. She took out a loan to pay for her chemotherapy after my father died. $47,000. The interest has brought it to $72,000. The man holding the debt is Victor Sloan. Dominic's jaw tightened at the name. Sloan, a bottom feeder, a parasite who operated in the gutters outside the family's control. He is coming at midnight to take our apartment, Gianna continued, her deep brown eyes shining with unshed tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. To take my mother's home. To take her sewing room. She was supposed to come here tonight. She had an invitation from your grandfather, but she collapsed, so I came instead. Dominic looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at the crimson dress. He knew instantly that the same hands that had sewn his grandfather's armor had sewn this dress. The stitching, the structure, the perfect, deliberate fit. It was undeniable. Your mother served this family for 18 years, Dominic said slowly, every word carrying the weight of a gavel strike, and nobody protected her when she needed it. He paused, the silence in the study heavy and absolute. That ends tonight. Act 4. The artifact reveal and the life debt. Dominic stood up from his desk. He towered over her, a massive silhouette against the firelight. He walked around the desk, his charcoal suit moving with a fluidity that belied his massive size. He stopped beside her chair, looking down at the open portfolio on her lap. The artifact. He reached down, his large, scarred hand hovering over the fabric swatches and photographs. May I? He asked, a surprising gentleness in his deep voice. Gianna nodded, her breath catching in her throat. Dominic reached deeper into the portfolio. He wasn't looking at the suits anymore. He was feeling the leather, his fingers exploring the worn seams, the hidden depths of the case. His long fingers brushed against something stiff, tucked securely into a concealed inner pocket. He pulled it out. It was an old, slightly faded photograph. He turned it over. The image showed an older, distinguished man in a perfect charcoal suit, sitting in a high-backed leather chair. He was holding a baby boy in his arms, looking down at the child with a rare, unguarded expression of absolute love. Dominic went completely still. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was an absolute cessation of motion. The man who commanded hundreds, who made decisions that shattered lives and built empires, stopped breathing. The massive, powerful hands that held the photograph, the same hands that had signed execution orders, that possessed brutal strength, began to tremble. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned the photograph over to read the back. Written in faded ink, in Salvatore's unmistakable heavy script, was an inscription. To Lucia, you dressed kings. One day, this boy will need you too. SM. The silence in the study was deafening. Gianna watched him, her heart pounding. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the tectonic shift in his face. It wasn't just recognition. It was a profound, devastating revelation. The stoic, terrifying Don was suddenly breaking apart. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide, swimming with an emotion she couldn't name. It was grief. It was relief. It was the crushing weight of a massive debt finally being acknowledged. "My grandfather," Dominic began, his voice cracking, the deep rumble fracturing into raw, exposed sound. "He raised me after my parents died, when I was 4. He swallowed hard, staring at the photograph as if it were a holy relic. 3 years ago, on his deathbed, his last words to me were a command. Dominic looked at Gianna, his eyes locking onto hers. He told me to find Lucia. He said she was the only honest person he ever knew. He said to pay what he owed her." Gianna gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "I've been searching for 3 years," Dominic whispered, the confession tearing out of him. "I hired investigators. I spent thousands trying to track her down, but the trail went cold. They couldn't find her. She changed her name," Gianna realized, the pieces falling into place. "When she married my father, Marco Marchetti. She stopped sewing professionally. She just disappeared into her new life." "You were looking for my mother?" Gianna asked, the sheer impossibility of it crashing over her. "For 3 years," Dominic repeated, his voice gaining strength, a fierce, burning intensity returning to his eyes. "And she walked through my front door tonight. Through you. It was 1 km. The grand study was empty." Dominic had led Gianna up a private glass elevator to his penthouse living quarters. The kitchen was a massive expanse of white marble and stainless steel, gleaming under warm, recessed lighting. Gianna sat at the marble island. The adrenaline that had carried her through the gates was fading, leaving her exhausted, her bones aching. She had kicked off her cheap black flats, her bare feet resting on the cool marble floor. The crimson dress still glowed vibrantly, wrapping her curvy frame in its protective embrace. Dominic stood across the counter from her. He had removed his charcoal suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over a stool. His vest was unbuttoned, his crisp white shirt open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing thick, corded forearms covered in intricate, dark tattoos. He was making coffee using a massive, complicated espresso machine, his movements precise and practiced. The open leather portfolio lay on the marble counter between them. The inscription photograph rested next to it, a silent witness to their conversation. He set a steaming ceramic mug in front of her. It smelled of dark roast and comfort. "Drink," he said softly. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her chilled skin. She looked at him, really looked at him. Without the suit jacket, without the physical barrier of the desk, he was just a man. A massively powerful, intimidating man, but a man nonetheless. He leaned against the counter, holding his own mug, watching her. "Tell me about him," Gianna asked quietly, gesturing to the photograph. "Your grandfather." Dominic looked down at his mug, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips. He was hard, old school. He demanded absolute loyalty and gave very little in return. But to me, he was everything. He smelled of cigars, old leather, and... He paused, looking up at her. "And your mother's fabric softener. He refused to let anyone else clean or press his suits. He said the dry cleaners ruined the soul of the fabric." Gianna smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made her glowing face even more radiant. She used to talk about him. She said he was a terror to fit. He would stand perfectly still, but he would glare at her through the mirror the entire time. But she always said he tipped well and never complained when she pinned him with a needle. Dominic chuckled, a deep, rich sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. "She pinned the Don?" Only when he moved, Gianna said, her smile fading into a soft sadness. Her hands were magic. She could take a flat piece of fabric and turn it into armor. She made this dress for me. She touched the crimson silk of her bodice. She always said she was sewing it for the woman I would become. I think she knew I would need it tonight. Dominic looked at the dress, at the way it hugged her curves, at the way the color contrasted so beautifully with her fair skin and dark hair. He saw the craftsmanship, the love stitched into every seam. She dressed kings, Gianna whispered, her eyes dropping to the inscription photograph on the counter. Dominic set his mug down. He reached across the marble counter. He didn't pick up the photograph. He placed his large, calloused hand gently over hers, which was resting near the edge of the portfolio. The touch was electric. It was the first time they had made physical contact. His hand was massive, heavy, warm, and scarred. Her hand was small underneath his, but strong, calloused from hours of kneading dough at the bakery. It was the touch of two people who carried burdens too heavy for most to bear. Gianna looked up, her breath catching. His dark eyes were no longer cold or distant. They were warm, amber where they had been black, filled with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "She did," Dominic said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "And kings pay their debts." If this story is stitching itself into your heart, drop the stitch in the comments and let me know you're still with me. Act 5. The Retribution and Reversal. The digital clock in the armored SUV read 11:45 p.m. The convoy of 3 black, heavily armored vehicles tore through the quiet streets of the Bronx. Inside the lead vehicle, Dominic Moreno sat in the back, silent, a monolith of barely contained violence. He had put his suit jacket back on, buttoned his vest, adjusted his cuffs. The dawn was back, but this time, the cold calculation was fueled by a roaring, personal fury. Gianna sat beside him, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She was trembling, not from fear of Dominic, but from the adrenaline, from the terrifying reality of what was about to happen. They pulled onto her street. Parked illegally in front of her modest apartment building was a leased black BMW. Standing on the front stoop, illuminated by a flickering, sickly yellow street lamp, was Victor Sloan. He was holding a manila folder filled with foreclosure papers. 2 large, thick-necked goons stood behind him, looking bored and mean. "Stay in the car until I say," Dominic ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. The SUV stopped. Before Sloan or his men could react, the doors of the 3 vehicles opened simultaneously. 10 men in black suits poured out, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. They immediately formed a perimeter, cutting off any avenue of escape. Dominic stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, inevitable stride of an apex predator. The street lamp caught the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand. His expression was one of absolute, controlled devastation. And Sloan squinted, trying to make out the figure approaching him. When Dominic stepped fully into the light, Sloan's polished, slimy exterior completely shattered. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, pasty white. He took a step back, bumping into one of his own men. Mr. Moreno," Sloan stammered, his voice cracking, the folder of papers shaking in his hands. Dominic stopped at the base of the stoop, looking up at the loan shark. He was a foot taller and twice as wide as Sloan. "You're lending money in my territory, Sloan." It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. A death sentence, if Dominic chose it to be. I didn't know," Sloan babbled, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "I swear to God, Mr. Moreno, if I had known this woman was connected to your family, I never would have. She isn't connected to me, Dominic interrupted, his voice slicing through the humid night air like a razor. He took a step up the stoop. The two goons behind Sloane instinctively backed away, wanting absolutely no part of this. She is mine, Dominic stated, the words heavy, absolute, echoing off the brick walls of the buildings. Her mother sewed the suits my grandfather built this family in. And you have her in debt for $47,000 at 40% interest for cancer treatment. Dominic took another step. He was right in front of Sloane now, towering over him, radiating a cold, lethal intent. Give me one reason, Dominic whispered, leaning down so his face was inches from Sloane's, why I shouldn't buy your entire pathetic operation tomorrow morning and bury you beneath it. Sloane couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He simply opened his hands. The manila folder dropped. The foreclosure papers spilled out, fluttering to the dirty concrete sidewalk like dead leaves. Leave the Bronx, Dominic ordered, turning away in disgust. If I ever hear your name in this borough again, you won't hear mine. Sloane and his men scrambled into the BMW, the tires squealing as they tore away, desperate to escape the shadow of the Don. Dominic turned to the SUV and nodded. Gianna stepped out, the crimson dress flowing around her legs. She looked at the scattered papers on the ground, the chains of debt broken, lying in the dirt. She looked at Dominic, her chest heaving. Come, he said softly, extending his hand. She took it. His massive, scarred hand enveloped hers. They walked up the narrow, creaking stairs to the fourth-floor apartment. Gianna unlocked the heavy wooden door, pushing it open. The apartment was quiet, smelling of bleach and illness. Gianna led him down the short hallway to her mother's bedroom. Lucia was awake. She lay in the center of the hospital bed, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. The medical equipment hummed softly in the corner. Next to the bed sat her old, heavy industrial sewing machine, a spool of crimson silk thread still threaded through the needle. Gianna rushed to the bedside, dropping to her knees. She pressed her forehead against her mother's thin, frail hand.
Mama,
Gianna whispered, tears finally breaking free, sliding down her glowing cheeks. Mama, it's okay. He's gone. Sloane is gone. We're safe. Lucia opened her eyes, struggling to focus. She saw her daughter in the crimson dress, crying, but they were tears of relief. Then, she looked past Gianna to the doorway. Dominic stood there, silhouetted against the hallway light. He had removed his jacket again. He stood still, one massive hand braced against the doorframe, the other holding the old photograph against his chest. He looked impossibly large in the small, modest bedroom. He slowly walked forward, approaching the bed as if approaching an altar. He knelt beside Gianna. This terrifying Mafia Don, a man who bowed to no one, lowered his massive frame until he was eye-level with the frail, dying seamstress. He reached out and gently laid the photograph on the thin cotton blanket over her chest. The image of his grandfather holding him as an infant faced up. Lucia, Dominic said, his voice, which had just commanded the terror of men, reduced to a raw, barely audible whisper. I'm Dominic, Salvatore's grandson, the boy in the photograph. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. Her trembling hand reached down, her fingers tracing the faded edges of the photograph, touching the image of the old Don. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her hollow cheeks. He told me to find you, Dominic continued, his dark eyes shining with unshed emotion. He told me to find you. He said you were the only honest person he ever knew. He told me to pay what he owed. He kept this. Lucia whispered, her voice breaking, looking up at the massive man beside her. "He kept everything," Dominic replied, a fierce, protective certainty in his voice. "He kept every suit you ever made him. They are in climate-controlled storage at the estate. He never let anyone else touch them. He said they carried your soul." Lucia closed her eyes, a profound, peaceful sigh escaping her lips. The terror, the fear, the crushing weight of the last 3 years seemed to evaporate from the room, replaced by the heavy, comforting blanket of legacy, recognized and honored. Dominic looked at Gianna, who was staring at him, her dark eyes filled with absolute wonder and a blooming, undeniable love. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. Act 6. The Confession and Legacy. 3 months later, the space was magnificent. Bright, airy, flooded with natural sunlight streaming through massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. It was a stunning atelier, a professional fashion design studio that smelled of fresh linen, warm steam irons, and possibility. High-end industrial sewing machines sat perfectly aligned on massive oak tables. Dozens of dress forms stood like silent sentinels, draped in the finest Italian wools, silks, and cashmeres. On the far wall, a heavy bronze plaque read, in elegant, deeply etched script, "Lucia Marchetti Atelier, established by the Moreno Foundation." Lucia was sitting near the windows in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. She looked different. She was still thin, still fragile, but the hollow, haunted look was gone from her eyes. The color had returned to her cheeks. She was holding a sketch pad, her eyes sharp and critical, as she directed 3 young, eager seamstresses who were pinning a muslin prototype on a form. She was no longer a victim hiding in a Bronx apartment. She was the master of her domain, fully funded, fiercely protected, and back where she belonged. Gianna stood at a massive cutting table in the center of the room. She was wearing a crimson-red dress, but it wasn't her mother's dress. This one she had made herself, under Lucia's demanding instruction. It hugged her generous curves perfectly, a testament to the skill passing from mother to daughter. Her fair, white, glowing, clean, attractive skin seemed to radiate joy, her dark chestnut hair tied back in a messy, practical bun, gold earrings catching the sunlight. She was measuring a length of heavy charcoal wool, her hands moving with newfound confidence. She heard the heavy, solid click of the glass doors opening. She didn't need to look up. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden, overwhelming gravity that always accompanied him. Dominic walked into the atelier. He was wearing a new suit. It was a dark, charcoal 3-piece, perfectly constructed, precisely tailored. It moved with him flawlessly, accommodating his massive, broad shoulders and heavily muscled frame without a single pull or crease. It fit him like a second skin. It fit him the way his grandfather's suits had fit, because the same hands had directed its creation. Gianna put down her measuring tape and turned to face him, a brilliant, breathtaking smile illuminating her face. He walked up to the cutting table, stopping just inches from her. He looked down at her, his dark, intense eyes softening with a warmth reserved only for her. "It fits," Gianna said softly, her voice carrying a profound satisfaction. "It always did," Dominic replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the air between them. He wasn't talking about the suit. He was looking deeply into her eyes, seeing the strength, the courage, the woman who had walked into his fortress and dismantled his entire world with a leather portfolio. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently tracing the lapel of his own jacket, the lapel she had spent hours helping her mother stitch perfectly. "I was looking for your mother for 3 years," Dominic confessed. The words quiet meant only for her. But I think my grandfather knew I needed more than a seamstress. I think she sent you instead, and I think she was right. Gianna's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric over his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath the wool. "Kings pay their debts," she whispered, echoing the words from that night in the kitchen. Dominic stepped closer, entirely invading her personal space, his hand sliding to her hip, resting securely on the curve of the crimson dress. "This wasn't a debt, Gianna," he said, his voice fierce, definitive. "This was a beginning. There are debts that cannot be measured in dollars. They live in the stitches of a suit, in the thread of a dress, in the hands that carry a leather portfolio through the gates of an empire at 10 o'clock at night. Lucia Marchetti sewed kings, and her daughter wore the courage to become one. If you've ever been Gianna, carrying your mother's legacy into the unknown, type "The Stitch" in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? The journey from that terrifying midnight confrontation to this bright, sunlit atelier had not been immediate. Healing was a slow, deliberate, agonizing process, much like the painstaking hand-stitching of a bespoke suit. In the weeks that followed Sloane's banishment, Dominic Moreno had systematically, ruthlessly dismantled the walls of desperation that had imprisoned the Marchetti women. He didn't just pay off the medical debts, he obliterated them with the stroke of a pen, transferring Lucia's care to the finest private oncologists in Manhattan. The small Bronx apartment, with its fading wallpaper, creeping damp, and memories of terror, was replaced by a spacious, sun-drenched loft in the city, a space specifically chosen for its vast windows and natural light, perfect for a master seamstress's eyes. Gianna had spent those first few weeks in a state of profound, disorienting shock. She had stubbornly continued working her early shifts at DiMaggio's bakery, the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, the smell of yeast, and the heat of the ovens offering a grounding anchor in a world that had suddenly become unimaginably vast and complex. But every afternoon, when she returned to the new loft, the reality of their changed lives would wash over her anew. The most profound change, however, wasn't the luxurious surroundings or the world-class medical care. It was the constant, unwavering presence of Dominic Moreno himself. He was not a man of grand, empty, flamboyant gestures. He didn't shower them with meaningless, ostentatious gifts. Instead, he offered something infinitely more valuable to a family that had spent years in the shadows: his time, his absolute protection, and his quiet, fierce attention. He would arrive at the loft in the early evenings, leaving his imposing army of guards downstairs. Inside their sanctuary, he was simply Dominic. He would sit by Lucia's bed, bringing her rare imported Italian teas, listening for hours to her stories of the old days, of Salvatore's terrifying moods, his absolute insistence on perfection, and the quiet moments of humanity the old Don had only ever shown to his tailor. For Gianna, his presence was a slow, steady, inescapable intoxication. They would often stand on the loft's sweeping balcony, the glittering, chaotic city lights spreading out before them like a diamond-dusted carpet. He would ask her about her day, his intense dark eyes locked onto her face, listening intently to her descriptions of the bakery, of the intricate, exhausting process of creating perfect pastries. He found a strange, mesmerizing parallel between her work with flour, butter, and sugar, and her mother's work with silk, thread, and wool. Both required patience, precision, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the raw materials. It was during these quiet, stolen evenings that the true foundation of their connection was forged in iron. It wasn't built on explosive fireworks or dramatic, reckless declarations. It was built on a deep, unspoken shared understanding of burden, of crushing duty, and of the quiet, enduring, unbreakable strength required to survive when the world tries to crush you. Gianna, with her radiant, glowing skin, her generous curves, and her deep, fiercely honest brown eyes, had slowly, irrevocably become his sanctuary. And Dominic, the terrifying, unyielding, brutal Don of the eastern seaboard, had become her immovable, eternal shield. The establishment of the Lucia Marchetti Atelier had been his ultimate, silent tribute. He hadn't just given them a profitable business, he had restored their stolen legacy. He had taken the hidden, unacknowledged, underappreciated brilliance of Lucia's hands and placed it center stage, ensuring that the entire city would finally recognize the magnificent artistry that had clothed kings. This wasn't just about paying a debt. It was about righting a decades-old wrong. It was about ensuring that the name Marchetti commanded the same quiet, absolute respect in the fashion world that the name Moreno commanded on the streets.